Welcome to Stories from the Village of Nothing Much. Like easy listening, but for fiction. I'm Kathryn Nicolai. I write and read all the stories you'll hear on the Village of Nothing Much. Audio engineering and sound design is by Bob Wittersheim. In our show notes, you'll find links to our ad-free premium version, our other shows, and our new wind down box, a quarterly sleep subscription box full of products I've handpicked to bring a little more joy and ease to your bedtime. I love miniature things. I'm not embarrassed to admit it. I love miniature, teeny things. I could look at little dioramas or doll houses all day. Or a Christmas village. Come on, I love a Christmas village. Where you can look into the shop windows and see what's on the shelves. Look at the people with the snow on their shoulders and the wrapped packages in their arms as they walk through the village streets. And that's kind of what I try to create in my stories. Just this little world that you can peer into for a bit and see what's on the shelves, or what's being served for dinner, or what lies beyond a doorway. So, don't expect these to go anywhere. There's nothing for you to keep track of as you listen. You can just let this be a meditative, sensory experience that hopefully helps you relax and focus on some good things. And if you stick around at the end of the episode, I'll give you a little background information on each story. Now, I think this will help you feel good. Take a deep breath in through your nose and sigh from your mouth. Again, breathe in deep and out with sound. Good. Our stories today take us through some gentle adventures for the near end of summer. We'll start with the potter's wheel, where we can dig our thumbs into the clay and see what can be created. Then we'll take a stroll through the aisles of the corner store to pick up a few things for supper, stopping to peruse the fizzy drinks and the first squashes of the season. Finally, we'll step out onto the Labyrinth, where we can settle a busy mind, find some space to begin again, and even spy a bit of magic. The potter's wheel. I'd been away from it for a few days. We'd taken a long weekend to go camping, and it had felt so good to step out of our schedules and routines. We'd told the time by the angle of the sun and the grumbling of our stomachs. We hiked and swam and cooked and ate and told stories over the fire at night. The days full of sunshine and fresh air left us happily exhausted when we climbed into our sleeping bags each night. And though I thought I'd struggle to get comfortable in our tent, sleep would come thick and heavy, and I'd barely move, waking in the same position I'd drifted off in. The last day, the winds had picked up, and before we loaded up the car to head home, we'd taken advantage of the cooler weather to climb a steep path to the top of an overlook and sit for an hour or so in the breeze, looking down into a valley of rippling leaves and tall grasses. It had left my skin smelling like summer, and even now that we were home, if I tucked my nose into the crook of my elbow, I could detect it. I'd spent the morning sorting laundry, washing and hanging our clothes out on the line in the backyard. The house had been stale and stuffy when we got home, but all the windows were open now, and I'd picked a vase full of lilies for the kitchen table. They were stargazers, pink and fuchsia with deep rose freckles, and with a sweetness that must call to bumblebees from miles around. When I'd arranged them in the vase and filled it with water at the tap, I'd noticed how heavy it was. It was one of the first vases I'd thrown on my pottery wheel, and I'd kept it. Not because it was a beautiful specimen of what I could make, but because it wasn't. It was where I started. It was too heavy, its walls too thick. It was made without a definite shape in mind, and it hadn't ever found one. The glaze was patchy and smeared, but it had my initials scraped into the bottom, and I was still proud of it. I suddenly wanted to get back to my wheel, to throw something, a few somethings, and just feel the clay slipping through my fingers again. I poured a fresh cup of coffee and stepped into the small room where I made things. It was a little space that had probably once been a pantry. Our old farmhouse was one of those sorts of places that got added onto again and again, and the layout was creative and a bit roundabout. I liked it. I felt like I was tucked into a pocket when I was in here. It had one window that looked into the backyard, where I could see the clothes billowing in the wind. I rolled up my sleeves and unwrapped a chunk of clay. I used my wire cutter to separate a good-sized piece and wrapped the rest back up. I set up my tools by the wheel, a fresh bowl of water, sponges, a steel scraper, a potter's rib, and a large, sturdy paper clip that worked as well as anything else I'd found to sculpt with. I started by wedging the clay, a process that was a bit like kneading bread dough and helped to remove air bubbles. I pummeled and pushed and compressed until it felt ready in my hands. Then I sat at the wheel and, with a big, satisfying slap, anchored it onto its center. Well, it seemed like the center, but the next step, as I began to set the wheel spinning, was to actually center it. This took a bit of muscle and concentration as I leaned my weight into the clay and wrestled it into alignment. Honestly, I liked this part of potting. Some might find it tedious and would want to get right onto the more delicate steps, but I found it cathartic and primal. The clay and I might start off in opposition, but after a minute or so of work, we would slip into easier accord and begin to create together. I imagined all artists and craftspeople have probably felt a moment like that, when the work begins to guide you, to talk back or to clear a new path. It happened often when I began to pull the clay up, lengthening my pot and then pushing it back down and pulling it up again to begin to define its shape. It happened now as what I thought would be a vase started to become something else. What was this? A beaker? A pot? Oh, it was going to be a pitcher, a ewer with a tall, ridged body. And I shaped it with my tools and sponge. Every part of what I was doing took practice. And even with a couple years of it under my belt, I regularly got bits of it wrong. Sometimes I didn't wedge enough, and the air trapped in the clay would expand in the kiln and blow the whole thing apart. Sometimes I made my pieces too heavy, or I thinned them too much and pushed them off center till they spun out on the wheel. One of my teachers, who'd noticed me being too fearful of all of the above, spent a day with me, making and smashing down the same shape over and over. We'd pull it up, refine the rim, and give it a neat base, and then she'd stop the wheel and tell me to wreck it. It was bitter medicine to swallow, but she was teaching me that my skill wouldn't disappear after a misfire. I didn't have to be so careful or afraid of just trying something or to make a mess. I could begin again, over and over, and I should. I stopped the wheel and carefully shaped the pouring lip of the pitcher, looking for the right angle so that the water wouldn't drip when it was used. And then I wired it off the wheel and reached for more clay to pull the handle. I dipped my fingers into the water and began to stretch and pull the shape. I got it wrong twice before I found the right length and structure, then scored the pitcher and painted on thin slip to attach it. Sometimes the trickiest part is knowing when to stop, and I thought I'd found the moment. It would need to dry on the rack till it was leather hard, and then I could smooth and finish the surface and put it through its first firing, then glaze and another trip to the kiln. I stepped out to the kitchen sink to wash the dry clay from my hands and saw that the breeze had picked up and one of my shirts was hanging on by a single clothespin. I'd go out to take down the laundry and then get right back behind my wheel. The corner store. There was a big supermarket near the interstate, outside of town, and it was a good one. I could find nearly anything I was looking for there, and probably once a month I went and stocked up on all my staples. My pantry was full of the cartons of broth and tiny cans of tomato paste that I bought there. Because of that nice big store, I always had packets of yeast for baking, sleeves of saltines for my soup, and rolls of parchment paper to line my cookie sheets, and I was glad for it all. But my true love was my corner store. 1 block up and 1 over from my house. It had been there for ages. In fact, my dad had stocked shelves there while he was in high school. I'd bought candy necklaces and puzzle books there when I was a child, and now, at least twice a week, I stopped in to see what they had. The corner store was always a bit of a surprise. It was a family business, and there were usually a few generations present on any given day. Unlike the big supermarket, whose seasonal inventory rotated on a tight schedule, it seemed they had their own system for deciding what to order and when, and it was a bit capricious, and, while never completely reliable, was always interesting. Last winter, after days of snow and gray skies, I tromped in to find a big display of pineapples, mangoes, and flip-flops. And while I'd passed on the flip-flops, the fruit was brilliant. The whole thing had brightened my day. They had a corner for toys and magazines, a shelf of light bulbs and spare fuses, a well-stocked section of spices and teas, and plenty of hidden treasures, if you took the time to really scour the shelves. Today I strolled in after work, hoping to find something to fix for dinner. I was never so foolish as to come with a list in hand, a recipe's requirements written out. You had to back into an idea based on what you found, not the other way around. But to be honest, that was the kind of cook I was anyway. I barely ever planned. I liked to just improvise. The sliding door was open to the late summer air as I walked up to the shop. The front windows were decorated for back-to-school season, with stacks of books lining the bottom edge. There was an old desk, the kind with the seat attached, and the small groove dug into the top of the wooden surface to hold your pencil. It was centered in one window with a display of spiral notebooks and juice boxes and kid-friendly snacks. Just inside the door, I bent down for a basket and started down a long aisle toward the back. I usually browsed the fruits and vegetables first. If they could get things from local farms, they did, and I found a big bin of sweet corn that still had some decent ears in it. The peak of tomato season had passed, but now they had a couple boxes of the big, slightly bruised ones that had ripened last and would be best for canning. The first squashes were out, butternut and acorn, spaghetti and delicata, and beside them was a row of large green cabbages. Such a versatile vegetable. I loved a cabbage. I could chop it for slaw, make a gallon of soup, and still have some to roast to a golden brown in the oven. I hefted one into my basket. Beside the produce was a small section of bread and baked goods, most of which came from the bakery downtown. By the early evening, there were only a few things left, but I got lucky and found a soft, herby fougasse. It was a bit like a focaccia, but baked on a hot stone rather than in an oiled pan, so it was crispy on the outside and chewy and soft inside. It would go perfectly with a chopped green goddess cabbage salad. I added it to the cart. One of my favorite sections was the beverage section. Someone in this family business loved interesting sodas and fizzy waters, and so did I. Now, I've always been a fan of a good ginger ale or a root beer. But what a treat it was to bring home a bottle of something I hadn't tried before. There was a passion fruit drink from New Zealand, another with lychee and raspberry from Pakistan, and one flavored with guarana fruit from Brazil. I turned each bottle over in my hands, reading what I could of the labels and sounding out their names. Finally, I decided to go with the lychee and raspberry soda, wedging it in beside the cabbage. In the next aisle, I saw my neighbor with a couple packets of ramen noodles in his hand as he read through the flavors. I sidled up beside him and asked, "What's for dinner?" He smiled as he recognized me and gestured to the dozens of options on the shelf. "My world is an oyster," he laughed. We caught up a bit over the noodles. He'd opened a bicycle shop in downtown a few months ago, and business was going well. I joined in on a few of the group rides the shop sponsored over the summer, and had my 3-speed in for a tune-up a while back. He told me how he liked to doctor up his ramen with a homemade peanut sauce and fresh sliced scallions. And soon I found myself reaching for a few packets of the ginger garlic variety. I promised to see him at the next bike ride and headed up to the register. Now, if you think you're done with your shopping, the register might change your mind. There are all sorts of treasures laid out on that long, scrubbed bench. Yes, cookies and candy and other treats you might expect, but also quart boxes of the first Honeycrisp apples of the season, a pyramid of tiny pumpkins, a box of polished rocks with a handwritten sign saying they had come from the creek that ran behind the farmer's market. There were jars of the pickled watermelon rind they made up at the inn, a floppy, self-published book of local ghost stories, and small glass jars of maple syrup from the trees down the road. As I unloaded the basket, adding in the book of ghost stories and a little bouquet of coneflowers, I chatted with the woman ringing up my groceries. "Oh, you got the lychee soda," she said, as she carefully settled it into my bag. "Are you the one who keeps stocking all the special drinks?" I asked, feeling like I'd finally cracked the code. "Guilty," she laughed, handing me my change. "Well, I can't wait to see what you find next," I said, as I took my bags and headed home to make dinner. The Labyrinth. In the gardens of the big house, on the far side of an open meadow, where deer have worn narrow trails through the grass, there is a stone wall that was built when our great-grandparents were children. And often, when I am out there, my shoes damp with dew on a summer morning, I feel like it's possible to slip through time. I look across the meadow and watch purple coneflowers bobbing in the wind, and listen to whippoorwills and mourning doves layering their calls one over the other, and think that this hour could belong to a day from 100 years before, and that maybe through some trick of the unseen world, by stepping into a footprint laid deep in the ground, passing under a particular branch at the right moment, when the moon is in a certain place in the sky, with Venus rising over her shoulder, I might have fallen out of the fabric of time and into another moment. This little bit of fanciful imagination is a leftover from childhood. I am still looking for the door into the other world. I might run my hands over the stone wall, feeling the smooth rock face and the rough, gravelly mortar, and find a tiny hole that could be a keyhole, and check my pockets, just in case a wrought iron skeleton key had somehow been magicked there for me to find. I doubt I'll ever stop this little habit of looking for magic. On this morning, the mist made from the warm air floating over the lake was still lingering around the edge of the water and between tree trunks, like cotton batting that had been stuffed into place by invisible hands. I went around the edge of the stone wall, a wide-brimmed straw hat in my hand in preparation for when the sun made its way over the treetops. The air smelled sweet, like grass and lake water, and had the cool, clean feeling that rejuvenates you when you breathe it in. How lovely to be reminded that every morning can be a fresh start, that you can begin again just by deciding to. I kept walking, with the stone wall receding behind me and the grass becoming thinner at my feet. I was almost there now. The labyrinth was in front of me, and this morning I looked to be the only one here to walk it. Though even on days when there were many people out to stroll its paths, it was always a quiet place. People didn't come here to chat or socialize. They might give you a small wave or a kind, acknowledging nod, but they'd leave you to your walk, and you'd leave them to theirs. Labyrinths come in all sorts of shapes and styles, and I've walked them in many places around the world. I've found them in city squares in front of old cathedrals, made of polished marble and granite laid out in an intricate pattern in the street. I found them in the woods, made from fallen branches, in city parks drawn with the bright lines of spray paint, and of course here beside the gardens of the big house, where its paths and hedges are just visible from the map room. This labyrinth has paths bordered by low shrubs that are trimmed neatly so their even tops are only a foot above the ground. You can see where the path takes you. There's no secret about it. That's the difference between a maze and a labyrinth. A maze asks you to solve a puzzle. It might trick you into a dead end and send you back to try another route. But a labyrinth is just giving you somewhere to place your feet and a way to practice journeying with calm attention. It might take you down a winding trail that turns back and forth again and again before you arrive at its center. But it's nothing to unravel or conquer. It's just a process of movement. The paths themselves were laid with tiny white stones, which were regularly and carefully raked by a volunteer from the house at the end of the day. I was the first to step onto them this morning, and I took a moment just to be grateful that people were kind enough to care about such things. So many kind people work behind the scenes of everyday life. We often don't see the bite-sized gestures that are made a million times a day to make the world a little softer and more welcoming to others, but they are still happening. I reminded myself to do my own part in that work today. Maybe I'd pick up a bit of garbage along the road, or leave the best parking spot for someone else, or just not take more than I needed. It all added up. At the edge of the labyrinth path, I stopped and slid my feet together underneath me. I thought of the way that cats often sit with their front paws together, their toes in a row when they are watching birds outside the windows. It seemed like a sign of deliberation and watchfulness, so I had adopted it as a habit before I took my step. I caught my hands together behind my back and felt my breath moving over my lip. Sometimes I brought a specific thought to chew on while I worked. And when I did, I often found that the steady rhythm of my gait evened my mind out. I might not know the answer to a question I'd carried in at the start, but by the end I felt more relaxed with not knowing, safe to just keep asking. Today, after a good night's sleep, my mind was already a bit like the lake on the other side of the garden. A few ripples on the surface, but mostly still. So just walking, feeling the weight shift from heel to toe, was the main event, and enough to keep my attention. I followed the turns in the path, let them take me nearly all the way around the labyrinth, and then a step closer to its center, and nearly all the way around the other way. At its heart was a large, flat piece of slate, with hedges around it, trimmed to point to the 4 cardinal directions. As I stood there, the wind picked up around me and rushed through the treetops. I closed my eyes and thought that maybe in these small moments, when we feel quite tied into the world, when we remember that we can begin again and that our only real work is kindness, maybe that is when the door opens. Maybe that is magic. I realized as I was putting these stories together that these are 3 experiences I haven't had. I've never thrown a pot on a wheel. There is no corner store in my neighborhood, and I've never walked a labyrinth. But that is part of the fun of getting to write these stories. I get to learn about things I don't know, to play pretend a bit and imagine myself in these places. Think about what I might enjoy about the experiences, which, by the way, if you ever feel like creating a story for yourself, might be where you start. Something you'd like to learn about, or a place you'd like to visit. The Potter's Wheel story gave me the chance to look up the tools potters use to sculpt, and this is always part of my research. Most of my Google searches are like parts of a door handle, parts of a mailbox, names of sculpting tools, because almost without fail, you will run into some cool words. This is always true when you're looking up like plants and flower names. Oh, and butterfly names. Amazing. But lots of architectural terms and tool types are also just interesting sounding words. So when I found out that there was a sculpting tool called a potter's rib, I knew I was headed in the right direction. This narrator, by the way, also appears in the story Winter Market, which is part of episode 1 of Stories from the Village of Nothing Much. In that story, she is selling her vases and mugs and other bits of pottery on the village square for the winter holidays. The corner store gave me an excuse to research all kinds of soda from around the world, and that was a lot of fun and thirsty work. Like I said, I don't have a store like this in my life, but man, I wish I did. And I love the bit about the small batch book of ghost stories for sale at the register. I wonder if we'll hear more about that at some point. Finally, The Labyrinth. This is one of those stories that I wrote in like one long sentence where it just poured out of me. And I had a feeling like the one described in The Potter's Wheel, of the work guiding me, of the sometimes adversarial relationship between writer and word suddenly becoming so companionable and easy that it would have been harder to stop writing than continue. While there is no labyrinth in my world that I base this place on, it does take place in an established location in the village. A great old house that has become a sort of local museum with a room full of maps on the top floor. You can hear more about it in episode 6, the story called The Solarium, and in more stories to come. The theme of beginning again comes up in both this story and The Potter's Wheel, and I just want to remind you that this is something that is available to you if you need it. I also have a meditation podcast called First This, and there is an episode for when you need to start again. It's called Begin Again, and I will put a link to it in our show notes. It's just 10 minutes, and it's fully guided. Thank you for coming to visit the Village of Nothing Much. Here's to creating without fear, to aisles of delicious things, and to finding the door into the other world.